Agutovach, welcome to tonight's shiur. Apologize for it being a bit earlier than usual. We have a farbrengen tonight, a farbrengen of Melave Malka. So brought the shiur earlier to be able to be in both places. So I want to start off perhaps al derech the inyan from the farbrengen. So we have here Yechidas. On the screen you have Yechidas from the beginning of Ador, Tovshin Lamed Zayin, with Rabbi Yaakov Sholem Grona. If I'm not mistaken, he was an older brother of Reb Leibel and possibly also older than Rabbi Yitzchok Grona, as far as I remember. And he wasn't exactly a Chabadnik. And as far as I remember him, he lived in Eretz Yisrael, more a little bit Mizrahi type. At any rate, here we have from his Yechidus. He asks the Rebbe, how do I relate to people who are driving cars on the streets in Yerushalayim? On the one side, it really bothers me. On the other side, I'm far from the Naturikata element, and I don't want to throw stones. So what should be basically my reaction when seeing someone in Machal Shabbos? So the Rebbe says, I also had the same question when I was with my father-in-law, Frederik Rebbe, whether it was in Riga or in Poland, and we met Yidden who were smoking on Shabbos. And I asked how should we respond. And my father-in-law, the Frederik Rebbe, said I should approach the Yidden and say with a smile, Good Shabbos, a warm Good Shabbos. And there's there's a very strong assumption that a heartfelt Good Shabbos said with a beaming face, this will encourage them to step back from Chilul Shabbos and bring them closer to good. So that's a very interesting answer. I've had this myself, this dilemma in the past. This answer just came out recently. They say you can see it's a Yechidus of a Rabbi Yaakov Grona from Tovshin Lamed Zayin. Okay, last Motzei Shabbos, someone called me up about 10 o'clock. It was after the shiur, and he says that he's sitting next to a friend of his who had said Retzei at the end of, in bentshing after the Melave Malka. Now, Motzei Shabbos, we don't say Retzei. So here's the question, what should he do now? Incidentally, he had said Retzei, and he hadn't yet said Uvnei Yerushalayim. So here's the question, if you said something which doesn't belong there, and does that disqualify your bracha, your tefillah, etc.? So this you have on the screen. I pulled out my faithful Shgiyos Miyovin Sefer, which is all about mistakes in davening, etc. And that brought me to Rabbi Chaim Noeg Sos HaShulchan, where he says, if on a weekday you made a mistake and you said Ya'ala v'Yavoy, or Retzei, or Al Nisim, if you reminded yourself before finishing the bracha, go back to the beginning of the bracha, which means to Rachem Hashem Elokeinu Yisrael Amecha. If you've already finished the bracha, you do not have to repeat. So this is quite surprising, but that's his maskana, and has sources for this, that if you said something which shouldn't have been said that day, that is not reason to have to repeat the bentshing. Could be that in davening, halacha rules are different, but this is what he paskins over here. Let's move on. So someone is asking that they had kept to a certain chumrah, and they thought that is standard chumrah. Let's say he thought it's a standard chumrah in Lubavitch to be machmer on this. Then it turns out that lav davka, many people in this community are not so machmer, and he only took on this chumrah because as a Lubavitcher, but not because he had particular inspiration to be machmer on that thing. And he's asking, what does he do now? Does he have to do, and he sees it's not so, it's a difficult thing. Does he have to do Hatoras Nedorim? So here you have again a specialist sefer, a sefer called Kol Nidrei, all about Nedorim. And he says if someone had undertaken a certain chumrah, and he thought that it's osur, and then he realizes that he thought it's a isur chomer, he thought it's a big deal, and it turns out it's not such a big deal. That's not called Kabbalah's neder. And then he says, similarly, if one had been upholding a minhag, because he thought that that was minhag of his family minhag, and then he discovered that that's not the case, and he wasn't personally interested in taking on this minhag himself, just to continue the minhag of his forefathers. So then he says, Ein kan Kabbalah klal. He takes the view that you don't have to do Hatoras Nedorim and such a thing, which is an interesting chiddush. I'll tell you personally, when I was in yeshiva, we were under the impression that if you want to eat before davening, then you should only do so if you want tefillin first. And Moshe Reb Nissen, not because of eating, Reb Nissen used to put on, he was there at Shachre, not Shachre, at Seder Chassidus in the morning, and he would put on tefillin and say Shema, and then he got ready for davening. He davened for hours every day. The same thing with Solneach, who was about 90 at the time. He would come in, and when we were the younger boys were davening, we didn't have Seder Chassidus before davening, and he would come in, stand next to his place next to the bimah. He would come in before Baruch Hu, and he would put on tefillin after Baruch Hu, and he said Shema together with our minyan. Then later he took them off, and then he went back to his room after davening, and he davened for a couple of hours every day. So I saw this, and then I became educated, should we say, that Lav Dafka, that we are so machmir about this, and particularly there was a letter of the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe, which was published. The Rebbe said, the Rebbe's father writes to the Rebbe, I'm very upset to hear that you are fasting so many hours. That, in other words, the Rebbe wasn't eating before davening. And he writes, I am insisting that you should eat before davening, or after saying Shema, or if you manage to put on tefillin, is even better. So from there I saw it's not such a rigid thing. So then becomes a question, do I have to be matin nedorim on the fact that I had been careful about this until then? So according to what's being said here, I don't think so. Yeah. Not to say that it wasn't such a minhag in earlier generations. So therefore, I might change the halacha. I heard that Gerenim asked the Rebbe Marash, possibly, or the Rebbe Rashab, that he wanted to eat before davening, and he told him no. But this is things which have changed over generations, where the needs for the generations that the Rebbeim said it's appropriate to eat before davening to be able to have energy for davening, etc. Okay. But before going away from this chumrah story, I also want to share the famous story of the Repila Paracha. I'm saying this, I had a conversation, I was Shabbos, I had a very enjoyable Shabbos in Edgware. They invited me to Fabring over Shabbos, in preparation for Yud Kislev. And someone we had last night, I was talking with someone about the whiskey, which is matured in sherry casks. All right, so there's a whole debate which I'm not going into now. Well, he said the story of Rabbi Paracha. Rabbi Paracha was machmir on so many different things, and whilst I was looking for this point, I saw that Rebbe Rashab said that he has more chumras than he has hair on his head. That's how many chumras Rabbi Paracha had. And once they asked Rabbi Paracha, why is he so machmir and everything? And he said that when he hears the maimer, he wants us the word chassidus is also opleggen. When you hear a word chassidus, and sometimes it registers, sometimes it doesn't. The more refined your senses are, the easier it will register. So he explained why is he machmir on all these things, so that it should be that when you hear the maim of the Rebbe, it should register. So that's just a message for us, for Chassidim. This is the way we were in the Schanech, that Chassidim were very prone to chumras. There's a chashash. If there's something concerned, it might be yes, might be not. So Chassidim were machmir. Yeah, I'm not going to go into more arichas about this, but it's the more fabringen inyan of the Chassidim are say hidur mitzvah and say chumras in leisase in how do you say in surmira and say not say to. Let's move on. So someone sent me this question about separating chopsticks. Apparently, when you buy sushi, So it also comes with wooden sticks. And there's two wooden sticks which are attached bereshom, and then you're meant to separate them, and then you have a whole acrobatic act how to pick up the sushi and the nefesh abamis v'chulam. So now the shaila is, can you separate these sticks on Shabbos? And the fellow who asked me the next question is, what happens if I did separate them on Shabbos and it's a violation of Shabbos, and then these sticks got mixed up with more sticks? But let's start off. So here we have from Shulchan Aruch. So where is this? This is in Hilchos Yom Tov. And it says, Shnei Kelim Shehem Mechuborim Yachad. You've got two items, Kelim, which are stuck together. B'tchilas asiyos, and that's how they were made. It would be a way of doing this, making two cups connected to one another, or two candles connected to one another. Well, ein poichasin oison. You're not allowed to break them apart, lishnayim, into two. On Yom Tov, attacking Keli, and how much more so on Shabbos. Actually, we just learned this, we're learning Gemara Beya in the evening, and we just learned about taking a wick and cutting it into two. You're not allowed to do that because you're making into two kalim from one wick, which is a wick is a keli. It's a vehicle for the transmission of the oil, of the fuel, and cutting into two. So now you've got two kalim. So you're not allowed to do that. If they were just stuck together by accident, that's a different story. Okay, so we have here that you're not allowed to separate them, and then it comes under Isser of what? Metakin Keli. Since you're not allowed to do them, so then if you did use them, then you become Asur to even B'shoigig. It's Asur until Motzei Shabbos. And then just so going on to the next question, if these chopsticks got mixed into other chopsticks, so then it would not become bottle, because we have a principle of Dover Sheyesh Le Matirin, a mixture which the heter, after a few hours, it will be all permitted. So then bittul doesn't work. So you wouldn't be able to, you wouldn't be able to use them on Shabbos because there's no bittul. So you can't follow the Rov. Right. Let's go on to our next question. So here's an interesting story. Now, I'm repeating this because some people are not so not knowledgeable about this. When you move away from your house, then there's an issue of removing your mezuzos. So here we have in the Shulchan Aruch, I think, where is it? In Reish Tzadik Aleph. It says, when you starts off, you rent a house from another Yid, then it's the soicher who has a duty to put up a mezuzah. When the soicher leaves, when the tenant leaves, he should not take with the mezuzah. If the money of the cost of the mezuzahs is important to him, is significant, so then the second person has a duty to pay the new tenant, the incoming tenant, has to pay the outgoing tenant. So this is standard stuff. The question here was that the outgoing tenant had put up more mezuzos than required halocho. They put up in, let's say, you have small niches or a small walk-in closet, which is a chumrah, it's not a din. The people are moving in. They are Shabbos, but not machmirim. They say the mezuzos which are required al pi din, sure, leave them and we'll pay for them. But the ones which are chumras, we don't need them, so you're welcome to take them. So now here's the question. Is it correct for the outgoing tenant to take off the mezuzos for the chumrah ones? So now look at this. This is from the Sefer Seichel Tov. It says here, he quotes here from your Shalmi, a person's dog bepundik, he stays over in a hostel. And the hostel is part of mezuzah. It's not your house. You stay in a hotel, whatever, you put up a mezuzah, you're not mechuyev to. When you put up a mezuzah in the hostel, you should not take it with you when you leave. He has about Munbaz, King Munbaz, time of the Mishnah. So he has something about they had mezuzos and a stick. Good, good. So we have here a story. You put up a mezuzah, didn't need to put up a mezuzah. So then when you leave, you can't take it with. And therefore, if you go on a holiday, and you put up a mezuzah, even though you don't have to, when you leave, you can't remove it. Unless there's a concern that if you leave it there, there's going to be goy moving in and then it's going to be disgraced, then you have a heter to remove it. So not such a big deal, yeah? Because if you go to a goyish place, of course you take the mezuzah with once you're leaving. But if you are in a place where it's a Jewish-owned place and there's no likelihood of the mezuzahs being disgraced, then you'd have to leave the mezuzah there. So let's say if you're in Eretz Yisrael and you go to a non-frum hotel and you put up a mezuzah, then you wouldn't be able to take it off when you leave. Well, the Fizeh, he writes, Sorchi, and what the Das Kedosh and the Bechot Rov says, that if you have a mezuzah in a room, which we're not doing yet, Potter, you just put it up for Shmirah, and he's considering that you are allowed to take that off and lend it to another Yid who has a chi of mezuzah, and he doesn't have a mezuzah. So here's an interesting situation. I have a mezuzah in a chumrah place. My friend doesn't have a mezuzah at all. Am I allowed to take a mezuzah from my chumrah job so that he should have a basic mitzvah? So he's considering that you are allowed to. Now, then you have the Yerushalmi, which says even though it's not mechuya, but you shouldn't take it from mezuzah. Possibly the Bechot who was a Talmud of Baditcheva and Rabbi Plemishlana, perhaps his attitude was a chassidische attitude. Yeah, richtig, that you are to take off a mezuzah is not okay, but that person shouldn't have a mezuzah at all. That you should stick with your chumras, and he should be the after mezuzah altogether. That he felt that you should give him mezuzah. A very interesting halacha, which I didn't realize until now that that's what he was saying. But that this is a sefer Svardish Mechaber Tzuriel Ta'asa, brilliant sefer on Hilchos Mezuzah. So he sees as a contradiction. I can see that where the Bechot Shirav is coming from. But coming back to our question, you're moving out, even though you put up the mitzvah mezuzah as a chumrah, that's not a heter. That therefore you should be able to take it off away when you leave. And she says in the next flat where they're going to, the mezuzahs which they're taking aren't enough, so that it's not as if they won't have enough mezuzahs. Okay, let's move on. This is the same thing. So now so a shliach asked me, he makes on Shabbos a kiddush, and he's thinking in the winter, could he have, in addition to having coffee and tea, it's in a cold part of England, could he also offer a soup? You have soup which comes in a powder. It comes in like a tall tub, a tub which is, let's say 5 inches high, 4 inches high, and it's got a powder, and you mix it into hot water, and you leave it for a couple of minutes. You stir it, whatever. I'm not talking. I'm clarifying this. I'm not talking about the soup in a cup which has got lox and noodles, and you leave it to soak for 5 minutes. I'm not talking about that. That Rav Forkash rules that's not okay, even though it's even within Shlishi. But here I'm talking about the powder which you mix in. So instead of putting in instant coffee, you're putting instant soup. So is that an issue? So he writes here, Bismanenu, this is again from Pesket Shuvas. So he's writing, he writes, one should be careful about various foods, powders, flavorings. It's very common that they are actually not fully cooked they're not cooked in their place of origin in the factory. They're just roasted, and therefore there is going to be a problem of kali habishul of cooking them. And Rav Forkash says almost the same thing. He says in the Melachtim Sforim, they write that there are powders which are actually not cooked in the process of the manufacture. And people think because it's instant, that means it was cooked already. And you should verify this before using it. Now, since I'm talking about this, there's also something similar actually with coffee. There's a type of coffee which The regular Nescafe is like a dark brown, but then there is what's called uh, roast, dry roast, I think, something like that, and
Freeze dried.
freeze dried. Thank you. Which somehow apparently some of that it's a lighter color, and in this there is coffee which is no hasn't been cooked, it's only been roasted. Now we know that there's bishul achar afiyah and afiyah achar bishul, and so regular in svore, regular instant coffee, which has been already cooked, then you could put it into klisheni, because in cliche as a solid, klisheni is not mavashal. As a liquid, so then again, klisheni is not mavashal liquids again, and as a solid, it's already been cooked. So although we have kali habishul, do cook in a klisheni, but this has been cooked already, so it should be okay. But the freeze-dried coffee becomes a question because it was before it was roasted, and now it's going to be cooked. So then yesh bishul achatzliya sachashash. So recently, actually, someone came to me and said that the shiur, but there's a koilul for the elderly balabatim here in Stamford Hill. So they said that Reb Shmaya Lev said over. He said that Rav Falk Zechayin Levrocha had said that there's a problem with this. So my reaction was that in Kli Shlishi, the oilam is made soymech on Kli Shlishi for tea bags. You should be able to soymech on Kli Shlishi also for this freeze-dried coffee. Vashgocha Protis, I met Rabbi Shmaya Lev on the street a few days later, and I asked him. He says, "Yeah, for sure. Rav Falk is machmer, but he himself feels that actually in a Kli Shlishi it would be okay." So, and I'm going around in circles a little bit now. I'm coming back to the instant soup. So the same thing. Although there is mokim to be machmir in klisheni, okay, because it could be that the soup, some of the particles, some of the ingredients in this powder are not cooked before the drying process. But in klishlishi, yes, lismoich, that klishlishi is not mavashal, and you would be allowed to use this powder in the klishlishi. Let's move on. So here's an interesting question. A mezuzah which was removed by a Goyish worker. Obviously, it doesn't matter whether it's a Goyish worker or Yiddish worker. The worker took it off. He thought that perhaps it needs to be removed, perhaps for painting, whatever it may be. The balabos didn't know. He didn't tell him to do this, and the worker took off the mezuzah. And that wasn't necessary. He gives it to the balabos. I'm sorry, and okay, now we have to put it back. So now is the question: would you put it back with a bracha or without a bracha? So here we have a similar discussion about a mezuzah which has fallen off. And he brings for Rabbi Yaakov Emden that you do have to make a bracha when you put it back. And then he goes in the Das Gdosh, I'm going to b'chotcherov, and perhaps it's the same thing as if your talus fell off and you're still wearing a talus cotton, and that you don't have to make a new bracha. Now, the Alter Rebbe does bring this. This is good to know. Yeah. Have you ever heard of these guys who, on Rosh Chodesh, they forgot that they have to daven Musaf, and they've taken off their talus and already put their coat on? Oops, there's a Musaf to go. They have to put the talus on. Do they have to make a new bracha when they put the talus back on? So assuming that they're wearing a talus cotton, then they do not have to make a new bracha. This is the Alter Rebbe Paskins in the Siddur, that somehow the wearing of the talus cotton means that you didn't disassociate yourself from the mitzvah of tzitzis totally, and therefore you don't have to make a new bracha when you put on the talus. However, if the talus fell off, my impression is, I'm not saying lamaisa, but my impression is that if the talus fell off, is worse. That even if you're wearing a talus cotton, you should still have to make a bracha on the talus, because there's no das at all. When there's das, okay. So I have das on the mitzvah of tzitzis. Um, Wait a minute. Mute on. Yeah, okay. Back to safety. Okay. So therefore, I'm not so confident that if if your talus fell off, that you don't have to make a new bracha when you put it on, even though you're wearing it as cotton. Coming back to the mezuzah, bepashtus, when you took off the mezuzah knowingly, so then there's a question of hesach hadas or not hesach hadas. But if you took off the mezuzah, if the mezuzah came off without das, there's no das, then there's no question of hesach hadas. It was, of course, it was hesach hadas. You had no thought of it being there. Therefore, when you put it back, I think you should be making a bracha, and I've got the Rabbi Yaakov Emden to back me up. Okay, let's move on to the next story. This is a very interesting question. We know that on the day of a bris, so at Shachris, if any of the Bali bris are present in shul, so then let's say, and it's at no Tachnun day. What's perhaps less known, but we discussed this a while ago in the shiur, is that if it's a shul where the priest will be taking place, even though none of the celebrants are there, it's also you have a ptur from Tachnun. Fine. But that's all for Shachris. Comes to Mincha, so everyone else says Tachnun. But the Bali Bris, they have exemption of Tachnun also for Mincha. So the one who asked me is a shliach somewhere in Europe, and he had made a bris, Baruch Hashem, Mazel Tov, and at Mincha, he happens to be the chazan. He's often the chazan. Shlichim have to do this kind of job also. So he's down at the Yomid, and he doesn't say Tachnun. So what do you do? Now, unfortunately, this kind of thing can happen also in the case of Avelim, Rahman al-Islam. If someone is sitting Shiva, and he's not able to get a minyan in his home for whatever technical reason, so you have the case where people come to shul to say Kaddish during Shiva. Now, although in the Beis Oval we don't say Tachnun, it's a mokum of dinim, and therefore we don't say Tachnun, not to compound dinim with dinim. But when the oval comes to shul, so then he doesn't dominate the event, and Tachnun is said. Okay, so everyone else is saying Tachnun, and he's not saying Tachnun. So similar situation, but here in the other side, other end of the spectrum, here's a Simcha and here's an Avelis. But the question which came to mind is, what about Yud Gimel Mitzarachim? Generally, is a minhag that when the tzibur are saying Yud Gimel Mitzarachim, Hashem Hashem Kerachim V'Chanun, you join in. And therefore, my question is, all right, so back to the question with the Baal Bris, he's the chazan. I told him, get someone else to take over the leadership of at the Omid for Tachnun, and then when he finished V'anachnu Le'neda, then you go back and you say Kaddish, which is okay. But I was just thinking, what about Yud Gimel Mitzarachim? And here you have a tshuva on the screen from Igris Moshe. It's Chelik Gimel, Chaim Chelik Gimel Siman Peites. And he talks about this. If you are, let's say, in the middle of Sukkot Zimra, should you be mafsik to say Yud Gimel Mitzarachim? And he's inclined to say you're not mafsik for that. But he seems to be more like, since the tzibur are doing it, you should go along with the tzibur. But he doesn't give it a very strong shiur. He has here an interesting story. If you are a Nusach Ashkenaz guy, and you come to a Nusach Sfard or Chabad shul, in Ashkenaz they don't say Hashem, they don't say Yud Gimel Zerachimim by Shachar and Mincha. They go straight into Nefilas Apayim. But if a Yeke Litvak comes to a Nusach Sfard shul, and they're saying Yud Gimel Mitzarachimim, so then he says he should say it with them. You can see this in Shuvas. He's saying, if you are coming from a place where it's not your minhag saying Yud Gimel Mitzarachimim and Vidui, and you're davening in a place where they are saying, you're not allowed to change from the minhag Beis HaKnesses. So here I'm not saying a clear answer. This person who's exempt from Tachnun, So he's not following the basic Knesset, not because he disagrees with the shul. He has a personal simcha. So is that like he's exempt from saying Tachanun with the tzibur? Is he also exempt from saying Yud Gimel Midas? Or is Yud Gimel Midas epis more chomur? I don't have a clear answer to that. Okay, now what I have here is one. I had a new question on Friday, which came in after I had sent out the sheet in the morning. And this is a question of a Hamish Yid in Stamford Hill. And he calls up, I am on duty at the Beis Horoah on Friday morning. He calls up, he says he's got a worker who works in India. Yeah, a lot of people, a lot of companies, they outsource and they have, let's say, people answering the phones or whatever else they do. And so he's asking, it's now Erev Shabbos. In India, it's already Shabbos. So, and a goy is not allowed to work for me on Shabbos. Shaila is, according to which time zone does the goy not allowed to work for me? According to the time zone in his place or in my place? Now, this question actually was raised by, as I say, for the Mordor Rov in Levushe Mordechai. It was a Hungary, a Rov, probably 120 years ago. And he had a question about animals. This is already a Shaila Deraisa. Because Abir Noch is a Derabonon about Shvisas Behemo. Said lives in Hungary, and he has an animal. Then already there was the Yishuv Yidden were emigrating to Eretz Yisrael, and the wealthy Yidden in Hungary who supporting the Yidden Eretz Yisrael, they bought oxen for them to plow, etc. And the shaila is whether the din of Shvisas Behemo goes into Mokem HaBehemo or Mokem HaBailim. This is his question. And this is a similar question over here, and then you can start branching out into chomets and all different things, where it goes according to where the activity is done, or according to the place where the owner is. And so here in Piskei Teshuvos, he addresses this question, and he says, there's no clear psak on this. He writes, Haminikshin is a kabel who to follow where the place where the business or the animals are located, not according to the owner. And lechumreh. And I'll tell you, I'm sure that Eden who own, we perhaps discussed this, right? I've written about this also. If Ed owns a factory or a bakery, he lives in New York, in Borough Park, and he goes for a Shabbos to Eretz Yisrael. There's an 8-hour time difference. So when he's patching the hand by Lechadoidi in Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, they're selling pizzas. They're baking bulkas in Borough Park, and people are buying. His shop is open in Borough Park. He doesn't close the shop because he went away to close the shop. Yeah. So it's really very much the same question. So Minhag HaOlam is, it looks like, that we're going to look at Shabbos where the activity is taking place rather than where the owner is. It's not such a clear-cut answer. The good old days when we used to get faxes of the sichas, and the Rebbe would give out a sicha on a Friday, and it was a Shabbos in London, and there was a fax a sicha service, if you remember, and Friday night, the machine churns out a freshly mugadik sicha, and here was a malacha done in America. Are you allowed to have benefit? Are you allowed to read it? This is all related to this. Are you allowed to have someone? Are you allowed to call up on Friday to someone in New York and say, it's 5 minutes to Shabbos, but when you get something to send me a fax. I'm asking you to do a malacha when for me it's Shabbos, for you it's not Shabbos. So this is a very similar question. Koponim, and he writes that the minhag is to follow the location where the activity takes place. My impression is that the Alter Rebbe is machmir on that. It goes according to where the owner is, because it means you've got shluchah shel kamoisei. So I've got long hands. I'm sitting in London, and I've got long hands. The hainu shliach, and my hands are pressing a button in New York to pray, to send a fax to myself. So I'm doing Malocha, even though where it's happening is in a different time zone. Advorim Arukim, Chaim Sholem Deitch was Noitel Hachmir on this point. Okay, but that seems to be the minig lahachmir, the minig to follow, the minig olam to follow where the activity is taking place, and so he would have to tell his workers in India that when it's sunset in India, erev ad erev, that's when they shouldn't be answering his phones. Okay. Whatever the mloch is, I'm not sure. All right, the last thing which we have for today is that last week I discussed the spelling of the word shmoinim, if you may remember, and it was because I had a chuppah last week, and I was preparing the ksuba, and I read up that it needs to be written without a vov, and because the majority of times the word shmoinim comes up in Tanakh, it's written without a vov. So Rabbi Broin, soll sein gesund, the Rov in Crown Heights, I'm sure he doesn't listen to the program regularly, but this is negaya to his job every week. I don't know how many chasnas Baruch Hashem. And first of all, he dug up the Rebbe's ksuba from now it's from Tov Reish Peites. Now the story is apparently that the Rebbe's ksuba went missing, so they did a rewrite of ksuba de Irkasa. But there it's written with a vav. All right, it could be you could say the person who was writing the ksuba de Irkasa was in a rush, whatever. But he shows now this is from Ancona in Italy, Shin Pei Aleph. Yeah, it's about 400 years ago. Shin Pei Dalet, and also Shmainim. The next one was in Venice, also. So someone's done a whole project on digging up old ksubas. So bear with me and enjoy the array of ksubas. This is in Pisa, also 400 years ago. Lupiano, also again Shmainim. Ancona again, Shin Peches, Livorno, Tov Pei, a bit closer, 300 years ago, Amsterdam, Padua in Italy, again, and then Reviggio, again, 300 years ago, Rome, 300 years ago, I think it's spelled Senna in Italy, Roma again, Senna again, Venice, Lucia, Venice, again Reviggio, Tov Pei Zayin, Connie, I don't even pronounce it. Also, Carpentras. Carpentras is in France. Actually, it's there was a time it was part of Italy. It's interesting, the whole story about that. There's a sefer called Maimon Mordechai. Maimon Mordechai is the Mefersh Shulchan Aruch. Around the time of the Alter Rebbe, he was a rowing Carpentras. Akolponim, they have also there's written Shmoinim, and how to pronounce this Chajish, I don't know. Padua again, Tov Kuf Pei, we're getting closer. So it's 200 years ago. Now, this is more contemporary, Bnei Brak, and this is the Stipler, the Chelas Yaakov. So here it's Esrim or Shmoino. So again, they've got here written with a Vov, and someplace in Morocco, and again, Italy again, Baghdad, Hamburg. I think that's the end of the list. But exhaustively, and he didn't tell me how many ksubas he found which had it without a vov. But meanwhile, he's showing that it was very widespread. Oh, here you got another few. Alexandria in Egypt, and Yerushalayim, Tofresh Pei Aleph, just over 100 years ago. Sfas, 100 years ago. Again, Sfas, and Warsaw again, also 100 years ago. Right. So what he's showing is that it seems to be very widespread that ksubas were written with a vav, and therefore gefährlich, yeah. So now going back, the fact that he finds that the Rebbe's ksuba was also written with a vav. So my impression is that he was more inclined to write it with a vav. So just to share that with you, and with this I'm going to end a little bit early. We have as I said, we have a Farbrengen Melave Malka tonight. I covered Chana for Kislev, and so wish you all a. Now I'm going to share with you one last thought, because I said that she's going to be till 8:45. So which I said in the Farbrengen today in Edgware. The Hayom Yom is one of the should we say most spitzy things about the Hayom Yom is that it's a calendar, and a calendar should start from Rosh Hashanah. This calendar starts from Yutes Kislev. Okay. Rosh Hashanah L'Chassidus. Okay. So Rebbe Rashab says Rosh Hashanah L'Chassidus. So the calendar starts from Yutes Kislev. Now the Hayom Yom has got entries, Chassidus Shaverta, inspirational anecdotes, stories a little bit, and it also has minhagim. Often the minhagim are in a different font. They're like kivyochel in italics, slightly, how do you say, slightly and diagonal a little bit, slanted letters. Koponim, you open up the Hayom Yom for Yutes Kislev. So it talks about Takis, Rosh Hashanah Chassidus, and it talks about Fabrengens and Achlotas Tevis. But the first thing it says, Ein Hashatz Misate Vitalis, Lemincha, V'Arvis, Bein B'Shabbos, Yom Tiv, and Bein B'Rosh Hashanah. So this is the opening statement, the Hayom Yom, that the Chazan does not wear a talis at Mincha and Ma'ariv. And you look at the Hayom Yom, Luach Eir Zorua L'Chassidei Chabad, and the first thing you have to know is that the Chazan doesn't wear a talis for Mincha and Ma'ariv. What's the pshat? So the Yesh Leimar, that this is the chilik, the chiddush of Chabad vis-a-vis Chassidus Chagas. You have Tzadik B'Mnose Yichya and Tzadik B'Mnose Yechaya. So Chassidus Chagas is that the Rebbe does the avodah for you. Chassidus Chabad is that the Rebbe gives you guidance, inspiration, but the avodah you have to do yourself. If you have to wear a talis, then everyone needs to have the talis. But I should sit back and he should wear a talis, das ist nicht Chabad. Therefore, ein Hashatz Misater Vitalis. I mean, everyone should wear it. If it's necessary, it's not talking Yotze sein. It's either everyone or Canaanist. Yeah. So I wish you all a Shana Teva, Belima de Chassidus, the Rocheha, Tikaseva, Vesechosemu, and we sollen sich misachet sein mit Malkeinu Beroshenu, mit Gula Shlema, Mismach Geula Legula, mit Geulam Shlema, mit Mashiach Zekenu, Behavior Meinu Mamash. Good Tovach.
Amen. Good Tovach. Shkoyach.